Um, Let me begin by welcoming everybody, and I'm happy to see so many of you in the audience. And I also would like to thank Kavita Singh, Anuba Dey, and the Aesthetic Project for their invitation to participate in this very exciting treasure and tragedy from the Oxus to the Indus Gandhara Bactria Bamiyan Symposium, as well as their excellent organization. I would like to further thank Renu Judge, founder and trustee of the Aesthetic Project, and generous supporter of this event. It is wonderful, once again, to be invited to speak on Begram, a topic that has been close to my heart ever since my undergraduate years at Leiden University in the Netherlands. Since having completed my doctoral research on this site, I have revisited Begram, the Begram material, really only sporadically over the last 20 years. But I continue to marvel at the richness of the material and how much is still left to explore and examine. I would also like to preface my talk with the remark that my voice is really but one of many diverse opinions about the nature of the site and the objects found therein. In fact, still after several decades, I find myself constantly challenging even my own assumptions. Because of the time constraint, I'm actually going to read my paper. I'm actually more comfortable doing that, partly because once I start talking, I don't shut up. And it will take us into varying directions, perhaps not all very conducive to this event's theme. I have the remote. And the remote is not working. Many of you probably know the ancient site at Begram, perhaps better known as Begram, located some 50 kilometers northeast of the Afghan capital Kabul, near the modern town of the same name, was an important node in the network of trade commonly referred to as the Silk Road during the early centuries of the Common Era. In 1937 and 1939, respectively, two excavation campaigns under the direction of Joseph Haquin and Ahmad Ali Khan Khozad of the French archaeological delegation in Afghanistan uncovered a large urban site at the confluence of the Gorband and Panjshir River. You can see that. The two rivers right here, and then the so-called New Royal City, Old Royal City. And it's interesting to compare sort of the old French drawing of the 1930s and overlay it on the satellite map, and you can see it's very, very accurate. You can still see the contours sort of in the landscape. And this square corresponds to this part of the New Royal City. Two rooms of the New Royal City revealed a cache of exquisite objects, among them Roman glassware, or Roman Empire glassware, better said, alabaster and bronzes, as well as Indian ivory and bone furniture and Chinese lacquer. In this slide, you can see the distribution of objects as they were uncovered by the early excavators. So this is how they were stored in room 10 and room 13, respectively. Founded sometime in the 3rd century BC, perhaps as a post-Alexandrian colony, in the 1920s, before any excavations had been carried out, Alfred Fouché, who's been mentioned quite a few times during this event, director of the French archaeological delegation, also identified later levels at the site of Begram as ancient Kapishi, believed to be the summer capital and residence of the Kushan emperors. Fouché based this identification in large measure on the records of the Chinese pilgrim Sven Zan, who had traveled through the area in the 7th century CE. and who had surmised that he had found Kapishi in the area where Fouché came upon Begram. Once the identification of a royal palace had been made, the early excavators surmised that they had come across a royal residence and interpreted the finds accordingly. Since then, this rich collection of objects has been firmly placed within the era of the Kushan Empire, a dynasty that emerged in the 1st century AD or CE out of an amorphous Central Asian confederacy called the Yuezhi, who had originally moved from the area of modern Xinjiang to Bactria in the late 2nd century BCE. Under rule of Kajula Catphysis, Vima Catphysis, and Kanishka, Kushan territory was expanded and at its zenith comprised an area from modern Uzbekistan in the north to the Ganges Valley in India in the south. Now, many scholars have seen and continue to view the Begram objects as a Kushan period royal hoard amassed in a palace treasury over the course of 2 centuries or so, with the rooms ultimately sealed up sometime in the 3rd century CE, perhaps to protect the contents from the armies of the Persian Sasanian dynasty, whose eastward expansion would put an end to direct Kushan rule in the region. Now, what happened to the objects after they were excavated? Per agreement signed in the early decades of the 20th century by the French and Afghan governments respectively, the objects were divided up into 2 collections. One remained in Afghanistan in the national and became part of the permanent collection at the National Museum. The other traveled to France's Guimet Museum and are now housed in Paris. Now, one can argue the politics of this. On a practical level, my work on Begram would not have been possible without the objects and the French archaeological delegation's archives in Paris. For by the time I became interested in Begram in the 1980s, Afghanistan had become the battleground between the Soviet invasion force and the resistance. Several scholars worked on the Begram artifacts in the decades following the initial publications in the memoirs of the French delegation in Afghanistan, focusing on individual groups of objects, such as the Roman Empire glassware, Chinese lacquer, or Indian ivory and bone objects, or even the coins. Now, my own work on Begram in the 1990s took a broader approach to the site, taking into account all the artifacts and their interrelationships, and posited the possibility that Begram might well have been a trading depot rather than a royal city, and the finds of contemporaneous 1st or early 2nd century CE merchant stock, rather than the hoarded collection of Kushan kings. This conclusion was reached based on an assessment of the extant archaeological data, which tends to refute the notion that the site was a royal city, as well as on more recently published work on individual groups of Chinese, Roman, and Indian objects. I think in this respect, the analysis of the glass was of particular importance. I believe that the late David Whitehouse of Corning Museum of Glass convincingly showed that 95% of the Roman glassware belonged firmly to the 1st century AD or CE and was no later than the early 2nd century CE. Now, new studies of the site emerged following the toppling of the Taliban regime in 2001, the re-emergence of Afghan archaeology, and the reintroduction of part of the hidden permanent collection at Kabul Museum. Ensuing exhibitions in Europe, the US, and Australia reignited an interest in the Begram site and the objects, which was still known collectively either as the Begram treasure or the Begram hoard. Catalogs containing new analysis of the chronology of the site followed, and new articles, once again centered on individual finds or groups of finds, were published. Now, the hoarded treasure theory has continued as the frame upon which widely separated dates for the objects could be stretched with relative comfort. New analysis of the Chinese lacquer were published, some confirming the early assessment of a 1st century CE date for the lacquer bowls and dishes, others another proposing a range of dates from the late 1st century BCE to the early 1st century CE. The Begram glassware was also discussed in new publications, most adhering to the early dating assessments by David Whitehouse, with some placing a few pieces, such as the so-called Pharos beaker, in the 3rd or 4th century CE. Extensive studies on the Begram coins were also published by Osman Boperaci, reassessing the chronology of the site itself. Now, the Begram ivory and bone objects, too, were the subject of a very lively debate on their date and place of origin. Renewed, compelling cases were made for the placement of certain specific series of carvings in distinct artistic environments, from where, these studies proposed, they were transported to Begram, either for use by the ruling elite or the upper echelons of society. Proposed manufacturing centers for the carvings have included Mathura, Amaravati, Sanchi, with the additions of Bactria and Kanaganahali, or Kanganhali, in the most recent studies. Lolita Nehru's extensive stylistic analysis of the narratives, in particular, zeroed in on the heterogeneity of the carvings, subdividing them into two main groupings, India, particular Mathura, and Central Asia, Bactria, underscoring the presence of a so-called northern tradition, even when discounting Gandhara as a possible source. Finally, most recently, the British Museum conducted the first extensive scientific analysis of some of the ivory and bone objects, examining the organic material, pigments, and composition of the metal fastening devices, which were made of a copper alloy, that anchored the plaques to the wooden skeleton. Most importantly, using Raman spectroscopy, this analysis concluded that in addition to the red, which was based on vermilion and hematite, and black, based on carbon pigments, identified already by the early excavators, indigo had also been used, which led researchers to argue that the ivories were most probably manufactured in India, though they also concluded that the presence for indigo rather than lapis lazuli on the Begram ivories suggested that these pieces were either imported, ready constructed from India, or were produced in Afghanistan by local or imported craftsmen to Indian patterns and styles using Indian-derived pigments. Although these are the authors of the study. Although the presence of indigo might for some confirm the Indian origin of the ivory and bone objects, it should still be noted that a 2013 joint analysis by the chemistry departments of the University of Bari Aldo Moro in Italy and the University of Pierre and Marie Curie in France of fragments of enameled glass from Begram, thought to originate from Rome and Egypt, found that lapis lazuli was used as a coloring agent, after all. In addition to the use of lapis lazuli as a blue pigment, calcium antimonite was used as a white pigment, which suggested to the authors that the glass was produced prior to the 2nd century CE. Now, to me, it is clear that without renewed excavation at the site, there will never be a resolution regarding the exact chronology and function of the ancient city at Begram in general, and the two sealed up rooms in particular. So the focus of my presentation is not to rehash arguments and counter-arguments on the nature, function, and date of the site. Instead, this paper revisits the ivory and bone carvings and singles out 3 key issues regarding manufacture, assembly, and distribution. First, that despite some stylistic arguments to the contrary, when looking to the furniture as a whole, certain aspects undermine the notion that the objects had traveled from different places to Begram. Second, that there may be a way to reconcile the purported stylistic discrepancies by divorcing the place of carving from the place of manufacture or from the place of furniture assembly. In this regard, the question of reuse becomes an interesting component. Third, as I've argued in previous writings, the evidence for a northern tradition in ivory carvings is strong and allows one to entertain the notion of a local production / assembly center at Begram itself, in the region, or possibly at Taxila. Finally, as an addendum, I will suggest that this paper will suggest the importance of future research taking a comprehensive look at trading patterns and larger economic context in understanding the rise and decline of the site. As mentioned above, the Begram ivory and bone furniture pieces were found together with objects coming from Roman Egypt and China, among other places, in 2 sealed-off rooms in site number 2 of the so-called New Royal City. This beautiful collection of Indian style ivory and bone carvings from Begram is unparalleled in number by any other finds of ivory objects in the Indian subcontinent. The furniture in room 10 seems to have been a series of footstools. The group found in room 13 a series of chair backs. Only the ivory and bone outer decorative layer remained. None of the underlying wooden structure seemed to have survived. The fact that the footstools and chairs might have belonged to the same set is underscored by representations on the carvings themselves. This is one example of a Begram ivory. There's the chair back and there's the footstool. As well as iconographic and stylistic comparison. So bear with me here. For example, footstool 12, and I'm using the original classifications, so that if anybody is interested in sort of looking this up in the early excavation reports, they can actually find it. So footstool 12 from room 10 has identical plaques to chair 2 from room 13. Most strikingly in the type of arched gateways separated by tall and slender balusters under which the women are depicted, as well as the secondary narrow bands with a row of crouching lions and vegetal designs respectively. So this is part of the footstool. Here's the chair, and you can see identical carvings. Footstool 7, of which only a few pieces remain, as identified by Francine Tissot in a catalogue of Kabul Museum, shares the row of dancing ganas and representations of women seated on beds or sofas within a square frame, with chair 5. In addition, footstool 9 shares analogous motifs such as the gryllus and the meander with chair 161 found in room 13. Now, the most significant piece of evidence for the presence of sets is the fact that Pierre Hamelin, who reconstructed, as part of DAFA, reconstructed the furniture, used nearly identical individual plaques from room 10 for the reconstruction of chair 161, which was found in room 13. So this actually has plaques that were found in the other room. Looking closely at the individual carvings, the great majority of images presented on the Begram carvings are of women, and most of the scenes in which they are depicted are set in semi-enclosed spaces suggested by gateways, doors, and fences. The most beautiful and elaborate examples of women standing under a gateway is presented by an ensemble of high-relief plaques, in which the gateways are depicted consisting of various types of carved pillars and architraves. I'm just giving you one example. A less intricately carved series of plaques shows similar scenes of pairs of women standing under an arch gateway or door. Larger settings in which groups of women are depicted are offered in a series of plaques in relief. Small gateways are depicted at regular intervals, either topped by an Indian arch or joined by slightly curving architraves. Parts of balustrades are shown on either side of the gateways, which seem to indicate that the area was enclosed but not completely sealed off. This is also indicated by the doors of the gateways, which were left slightly ajar, as if to invite the viewer in. Between the gateways are scenes of women relaxing, playing musical instruments, and engaging in other activities. The styles and techniques presented by the ivory and bone objects are very heterogeneous. Some are simple engravings, others are in higher relief. Some are made by gouging out undecorated parts to create a sunken relief with a flat surface, and some are in the round. Some of the contours are stiffly executed, others very sinuously. Some were painted, others were not. This heterogeneity, coupled with the early assumption that the objects had been hoarded over time, offered the freedom to scholars to assign different sets of furniture to different regional schools. Now, the argument that some of the ensembles are stylistically different and made in different places and traveled to Begram separately is a compelling one. I agree. Careful examination of all the ensembles, however, seriously challenges the assertion that the furniture itself was assembled or manufactured in different regions. And remember, here I'm making a distinction between the individual plaque and the furniture itself. In the first instance, as Pierre Hamelin and Jean-Carl's reconstructions indicate, different styles and techniques appear in the same piece of furniture. For example, in this chair 34, representations of women carved in high relief alternate with those executed by engraving. And, for example, stylistically different plaques seem to share similar details, such as the jewelry. That's identical. Plaques, very, very different. It seems that the artisans quite purposefully used heterogeneous plaques to create a visual interplay among the pieces of the same ensemble. In addition, despite the differences in style and technique, the majority of plaques are uniform in representation. Women depicted centrally, framed by secondary bands of mythological, vegetal, and architectural designs. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, all ensembles seem to share features that some may argue are not stylistically indicative of provenance, but which nonetheless provide proof that the furniture was at least partially carved and most likely fully assembled by the same group of artisans and craftsmen. In this case, we can point to chair 161, chair 5, chair 2, which share identically carved band of balusters as the lowest register. In addition, chair 2 shares the same representations of a Purnagata, Garmatsya, and Garuda on the feet as chair 34. Chair 34 and chair 2 have carvings of women standing on similar arched gateways. In fact, almost all the chairs and footstools have analogous primary plaques carved with women and secondary bands with representations of flying geese, crouching felines, and balusters, among others. Now, I think it's the latter that are key to understanding place of manufacture. The so-called secondary registers that are always ignored by everybody, including myself, initially, are, I believe, may be more important than the so-called diagnostic plaques. In sum, when taking a holistic approach to the entire corpus of material rather than focusing exclusively on individual pieces. In other words, we should really try not to cherry pick. The many shared elements provide significant evidence pointing to manufacture in the same ivory furniture workshop. Now, if one can successfully make the case, and I'm by no means arguing here that I'm doing this successfully, if you can make the case that the furniture originated from a single workshop, the question, of course, becomes where was it located, right? But also, is there an alternative explanation for the heterogeneity? Individual plaques coming from elsewhere. Now, if one asserts India as the place of origin based on stylistic analysis of monumental stone sculpture, disputes immediately arise about which monumental sites provide the best comparative material, right? There we go. Rishi, Sanchi, Varu, Mathura, Sanchi. To me, it's a somewhat arbitrary and ultimately not very satisfactory process which isolates a few motifs that favor one side, while another few motifs could favor another. That being said, a few stylistic variations pointed out by scholars such as Lolita Nehru and Elizabeth Rosen are striking and certainly warrant further explanation. Now, one of the footstools that has most intrigued researchers in this regard is footstool, so-called footstool 9. Based on the elongated body type and hairstyles, among other elements, it has been connected to the art of ancient Amaravati, Kanaganahali, and to that of ancient Bactria by Elizabeth Rosen and Lolita Nehru, respectively. I've already pointed out, however, that despite being stylistically different, footstool 9 shares elements in common with chair 161, which in itself shares features with chair 2, underscoring that singling out one or two plaques for stylistic analysis without taking into consideration the corpus as a whole is problematic and, in this specific case, can be misleading. One way to reconcile the differences in artistic styles and quality with the suggestion of a single place of assembly or manufacture is simply to argue that, one, the skills of ancient artisans, craftsmen, were versatile and not frozen in time and place, i.e., 1st century Mathura, 3rd century Amaravati, etc. And two, different artisans with different styles and experience could have been working in the same workshop. I've previously proposed that there's considerable evidence from historical sources that suggests that artisans were itinerant and could have moved to new markets or production centers, carrying not only their particular craft but also artistic trends from their places of origin. In this case, the evidence of portable artistry may serve to undermine somewhat rigid stylistic categorizations such as, quote, Kushan or Satavahana, as well as, quote, the art of Mathura or the style of Sanchi, that, in my view, continue to hamper a more complex understanding of Indian art in general, and the ivory and bone furniture of Begram in particular. Another way to explain stylistic inconsistencies is to consider that individual plaques may have been transported to furniture manufacturing centers where they were combined with locally carved pieces and compiled into the same ensemble. However, looking at the shape of the Begram plaques, the carvers seem to have a clear sense of the arrangement of the various ensembles. Besides, not knowing what type of furniture or other product the carvings were destined for makes this a less likely scenario given the amount of investment in the raw material and ultimately finished product. A third scenario, to date not well researched, involves the reuse of ivory. Now, in the mid-1990s, I had a conversation with the late Professor Boris Mashrak in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, regarding the ivory comb uncovered at the Kushan period site of Dalverzin Tepe, the only known example which came from the same workshop as one of the Begram carvings that I'll discuss later on. Now, Marshak intimated that the comb may have been manufactured from a larger, fully carved piece, suggested by the fact that part of the scene depicted had been cut off, while perhaps it was refashioned into a comb. There are some problems with this assessment, however. One, the comb was carved on two sides, and although there are open work pieces from Begram that were decorated both on the front and back, none of the analogous pieces from Begram were. Second, one might simply propose that the comb was wider originally, and at some point was broken off. Although there is no conclusive evidence that the Dalvazine ivory comb shows signs of secondary usage, the idea of reuse is an intriguing one. Ivory is difficult, if not impossible, to recarve. There are very few examples, such as a number of medieval Carolingian objects, where new imagery and inscriptions were carved onto the undecorated parts of existing pieces in later periods. There is, however, no hard evidence that I'm aware of for the practice of recarving finished ivory pieces in ancient Indian art in general, and within the Begram corpus in particular. That being said, there is a curious pattern in the distribution of drilled holes in some of the pieces. Seemingly random, non-aligned placement, at times positioned straight through the main narratives, such as in the now lost top plaque of Footstool 9. The original close-up photographs taken right after the excavation of Footstool 9 showed the top plaque in pieces with holes drilled across the plaque, including one right through the navel of one of the female figures represented. In addition, one of the side plaques of Footstool 9, depicting a woman standing on a circular drum, one can detect similar non-aligned placements. The same seemingly carelessness is seen in other pieces, such as, for example, in Chair 55, which includes one of the two so-called Jataka carvings recently included in the Hidden Treasure traveling exhibition. In this example, the holes are drilled or distributed in a non-linear fashion through the center of the piece, with one drilled straight through the joined hands of the centrally placed standing figure. It's important to note here that the plaques mentioned above are often cited as the stylistic, quote, odd ones out within the Begram corpus. It's hard to imagine that a trained artisan completing such a delicate and painstaking task of carving the intricate representation would follow it up by such heedless disfigurement while fastening the carvings onto the wooden skeleton. Rather, these placements seem to suggest that either the ivory may have been reused over time in different ensembles, or the ivory was carved in one workshop but assembly took place in another, by workers who were not the artisan carvers. Here one might propose that these plaques could have been repurposed and brought together with locally carved plaques and refashioned into new furniture ensembles. Even if one could conclusively prove that some of the ivory was reused, the question remains as to why an artisan would have used old carvings in new ways. Given the high price of ivory and its main use in luxury items, expense could be one simple explanation. In particular, if the furniture was manufactured by artisans for the market rather than for consumption by the ruling elites. In this case, the fact that the Begram craftsmen also supplemented their ensembles with bone may be significant. Within an analysis of the Begram ivory and bone carvings, it is important to address the issue of differences among materials utilized. The main technical carving difference between ivory and bone stems from their relative structures. Although carved in basically the same way, using the same tools, some scholars assert that bone lacks the oily substance which is present in ivory, and which both makes the latter easier to carve and gives it a finer, polished finish. Though other scholars are of the opinion that bone, when treated correctly, can attain close to the same finish as ivory. Bone is more brittle and is often subject to splintering, and due to its porous structure, bone gets dirty more easily than ivory. Also, because of its size, bone is only suitable for making smaller items compared to the variety of objects which can be made with much larger elephant tusks. In addition, bone decays at a much faster rate than ivory, which may partially explain why indications, the small number of extant artifacts, are that bone was not as popular a medium as ivory for the fabrication of non-utilitarian objects. Now, archaeological evidence indicates that ivory objects are known to have existed on the Indian subcontinent at least as early as the Indus Valley period, as shown by finds of ivory dice, ivory hairpins, ivory needles among the objects at sites such as Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, and Lothal. The material evidence indicates that ivory in the ancient world of Central and South Asia was rarely used for utilitarian objects. Most finds of ivory consist of jewelry, boxes, decorative panels, statuettes, and the like. The relative rarity and price of ivory compared with bone and other common substances would certainly explain why its use was limited to special objects. By contrast, bone was a common material, a useful byproduct of human food consumption, and as such, it was mainly used for objects of general utility, such as weapons, tools, and household items. Although there are examples from the ancient world of bone being utilized for more decorative, non-utilitarian objects, these usually occurred in regions where ivory was virtually unavailable, which was not the case in the Indian subcontinent. In addition to the archaeological evidence, early literary references make it clear that ivory was more valued than bone. The famous Indian epics, Mahabharata, the Ramayana, include numerous references to ivory objects and to ivory carving, which seems to indicate that the art had been firmly established during this time. Epigraphic remains too attest to the importance of ivory in the ancient world. An inscription of the Achaemenid king Darius I at Susa refers to the fact that the ivory used for the decoration of his magnificent palace was brought from Ethiopia, Sind, and Arakhosha in Afghanistan. Although the great stupa at Sanchi is the great stupa at Sanchi is adorned by dedicatory inscription, which refers to the ivory carvers of Phoenicia, having contributed to the creation of the building. Compared to the literary and epigraphic evidence on ivory, bone is seldom mentioned in the ancient texts. The utilitarian aspect of bone objects as evidenced by material finds, plus the dearth of writings on demotic subjects, are the likely combination that explains why there are hardly any references to bone objects. With the superiority of ivory over bone clearly established in the ancient cultures of Central and South Asia, the question arises why the carvers of the Begram objects utilized both materials in their carvings. Bone seems to have been used primarily, with a few noted exceptions, which I'm going to mention in a minute, for secondary brands framing the main larger scenes executed in ivory. Anthony Cutler, in a study of mainly Byzantine ivory art, also notes that in larger panels, bone is mainly used for secondary elements, such as floral and faunal motifs, and that bone appeared most frequently in pieces that were mass-produced. In the aforementioned scientific analysis conducted by the British Museum, the presence of bone objects among the Begram corpus was confirmed, reconfirmed. In addition to the secondary bands, according to the original excavation reports, there were also a few examples from Begram of primary plaques being carved in bone, most notably in room 10, a plaque depicting a woman seated on a horse-like creature with stylized manes, identical to a series of ivory carvings from room 13. Here, the finished object product is either supplemented or carved to distribute equal measure of ivory and bone. As suggested earlier, to explain the possible reuse of ivory, bone may simply have been the cheaper alternative to ivory. Since the ruling elites, one might argue, would certainly be expected to command the resources to supply artisans with the full amount of ivory needed for fabrication of royal pieces, the presence of so many bone objects suggests that the artisans themselves were producing furniture, perhaps for direct sale in an on-site commercial setting, perhaps in conjunction with merchants in international trade, rather than or in addition to the more commonly proposed patron-artisan arrangement. In the Shilivanaga Jataka, the story of the Buddha's past life in which he was born an elephant, there is mention of the ivory carver's bazaar in Benares. The forester, after being lost and helped on his way by the Bodhisattva, goes to Benares and arrives at the ivory workers' bazaar, where he sees artisans working on ivory in different shapes and forms. The description of such a bazaar with different types of ivory work going on in one place seems to indicate that the ivory carvers gathered themselves together in a particular part of the city, and that the work was significantly organized. In addition, there's mention of a forester offering to sell tusks directly to the ivory carvers, maybe an example of such commercial practice. Reference to an ivory carver's bazaar may also indicate more of a commercial system than a patronized one. Aside from the obvious economic advantage, the reuse of ivory and supplementation of bone in the Begram furniture might also indicate that ivory had become scarce or scarce, and that it was harder to come by, in particular for artisans working independently. Despite the textual references to the well-established art of ivory carving, archaeological excavation has only recovered a small number of ivory objects dated to the early centuries CE. The paucity of similar ivory finds from central and southern India is particularly striking, and even though most scholars believe it can be explained by the hot and humid climatic conditions further south, one could also hypothesize that it may have had something to do with the decline in the availability of tusks. Now, to be sure, there's no evidence in Indian textual sources indicating a fluctuation of ivory availability, or that India's elephant population was somehow on the decline in this period. In fact, given the frequent references to elephant forest, Astivana, in sources such as the Arthasastra and later sources, one would have to assume that India had ample supplies of pachyderms across the southern and eastern regions. The same text also notes the regular use of elephants in the army and the royal hunt, and as such, these herds were controlled by the king. From the classical sources, a different picture emerges. A reference from Pliny's Natural History, Book 8, Section 3, describes the scarcity of ivory in the Roman Empire, which relied exclusively on supplies from Africa. Pliny writes, "And yet of late for scarcity, men have taken up to cut the bones into plates, for it's rare to procure teeth of any bigness except from India, since all the rest in our parts of the world had been employed in luxuries." Two things can be gleaned from this passage, and of course it's but one passage. One, that Roman consumption of nearby African ivory, which really, here you can see came from southern modern-day South India to Alexandria consisted of 700 to 1,700 pounds of nard, which is an aromatic balsam, over 4,700 pounds of ivory, and almost 790 pounds of textiles. This has been calculated as worth a total value of 131 talents, enough to purchase 2,400 acres of the best farmland in Egypt. When it is borne in mind that an average Roman cargo ship could have held about 150 such consignments, Pliny's figure becomes entirely plausible. With such staggering profits, it is little wonder that the Roman government in Egypt encouraged and profited by the trade. The 25% tax on all goods from India was levied by the Romans at the Red Sea port of Lusicon. In other words, and I'm just putting that out there, it could be that in the 1st century AD, what ivory was available for domestic consumption had become much more valuable as an export product. Just like lapis lazuli from the famed Badakhshan mines in ancient Afghanistan, which almost never show up in local jewelry, which may have been too lucrative an export commodity to be used in locally produced inlaid jewelry, ivory must have fetched more on the international market as raw material. The Periplus of the Eritrean Sea, on which this map is based, a trading manual written by a Greek merchant, the Roman Empire, in the 1st century CE, notes that in addition to Muziris, southern India, the port of Barigaza, modern Broach in Gujarat, the port of Barigaza, modern Broach in Gujarat, was a place of ivory export as well, and mentions the region of Dorsaren. Oh, sorry, go back. Here. as yielding a particularly beautiful type of ivory, referred to as dorsarenic. Skof identifies dorsarene as ancient Darsarna or modern Darsa. Although it's unclear whether this particular text is referring to finished objects or the raw material, it is interesting to note that ivory was not exported from Babarikum, Karachi, Pakistan, suggesting that elephants from Sindh may not have been used for the export of tusks to the Roman Empire, which may serve to underscore the existence of a more thriving carving industry in the northern regions. If the cultural and political centers, at least during the time of the Indo-Greeks and the early Kushan dynasts, Kujala and Rimak Physis, were in the north, it is conceivable that ivory carvers from other areas of the realm were attracted to urban centers and their expanding markets, such as Dalverzin Tepe, Termez, Begram, and Taxila. From various textual sources, such as the Ramayana and Buddhist Jatakas, we know that the ivory carving was a craft that was well established, well organized, localized in urban centers, and part of a commercial market. Additionally, some of the evidence, as I stated, indicates that some ivory carvers were itinerant. It is this itinerancy that could be important in trying to come to terms with the heterogeneity of the Begram objects. There's ample evidence to suggest that ivory carving was an important craft in the northern regions of Bactria and Gandhara. The presence of ivory carving workshops at or near Nisa, Turkmenistan in the 2nd century BCE, clearly shows the high-level craftsmanship in the regions north of the Hindu Kush. The treasury at Ai Khanum, a site mentioned yesterday quite a few times, revealed several ivory objects. This pre-Begram tradition of ivory carving in the north is complemented by several 1st to 2nd century CE contemporaneous ivory and bone finds. As many of these finds have been discussed in my earlier works, suffice it here to single out a particularly interesting examples. The first analogous object comes from Dalverzin, a site situated on the right bank of the Surkhandarya, 5 miles north of Surchi in modern Uzbekistan. The excavations at Dalverzin have revealed a rich documentation of fortification, religious and urban architecture, monumental sculpture, baked clay, frescoes, and ceramics, including a treasure similar to what you find at Tila Tepe. According to Galina Pugachenkova, the formation of the town is to be placed in the last centuries BCE, reaching its zenith during the 1st and 2nd century AD. The aforementioned ivory comb, discovered at a small sanctuary in Dalverzin, is identical in style to one of the Begram ivory and bone carvings. So much so that it seems almost certain that both came from the same workshops and may have been even made by the same hands. Note in particular the carving of the large bowl on both plaques and the particular technique of dotting utilized for the furniture on which the women are seated. In addition, the bead and reel motif carved on the edge of the Dalverzin example is identical to one on footstool 9, as is the dotting technique used for the body of the elephants. Another ivory object, whose function is unknown, was discovered as a later deposit in a 4th century AD Partho-Sasanian fire temple at Mehendale in modern Turkmenistan. As shown in an article by Maya Kornaka, the ivory shares similarities with the Begram pieces. The subject matter of the women seated on decorative seats, alternating with the women standing under arched gateways, is a common theme in Begram, and the decorated band of quatrefoils on the right of the Mehendale piece is similar to Begram. Other ivories from northern excavations include a comb from Taxila, and other objects from Taxila exist as well, and that from Tila Tepe in northern Afghanistan. Now, in addition to the more frequent finds of analogous ivories in the north, stylistically too, the Begram material connects with the art of Bactria and Gandhara. The one thing I regret, when we worked sort of on the exhibit Hidden Treasures exhibit. I wish, in hindsight, that we didn't really look at the three corpuses of material as somewhat separate, indicative of the rich traditions of Afghanistan, but slightly cut off from each other. Because when you compare Tila Tepe here with Begram, the analogies are striking. It's a continuation of motifs and traditions. It is not a separate artistic tradition from what you find in Begram. The same goes for Gandhara, and here, Lita Nehru strongly suggested that we should disregard Gandhara. Nonetheless, just as much as you have in Mathura or in Sanchi or in Kanaganahalli, there are, analogies to Gandharan art as well. Here, perhaps it's also important to note that several of the Begram objects carried Kharoshti artisan or placement marks on the reverse. That could suggest a place of manufacture or at least assembly in the Gandhara region. And these are very similar placement marks as the ones that Richard Solomon worked on with regard to the sculptures. These are how, indicate how these would have been positioned vis-a-vis each other or in which sequences. The hypothesis that there may have been an ivory carving workshop at Begram itself is at this point still subject to further proof, and we won't get it until you have renewed excavation. But when once again looking at the larger collection of objects stored in the two rooms, there are several pieces of evidence from the site itself. First, there were several chunks of uncut gemstones, such as pieces of rough lapis lazuli, which may suggest either that a local workshop existed at Begram, or workshop tradition, or that it was a place where raw materials were traded with other goods. The Periplus of the Eritrean Sea mentions how lapis lazuli from the north, presumably Afghanistan, became part of Roman trade in the ancient port of Babarikam in modern Pakistan, and notes that carnelian was traded, which was also found in Begram, from Barigaza, or modern Brooch. The sources of these material confirm the general trade patterns as witnessed by the other Chinese, Roman, and Indian objects discovered at Begram. In addition, 3 unworked, uncarved pieces of ivory, each approximately 22 centimeters high, with a diameter of 12 centimeters, also lend support to the possibility, at least, of the presence of a local workshop. Almost 5. Perfect. As mentioned earlier, conclusively reconciling stylistic inconsistency and chronological discrepancies may be impossible without renewed excavation at Begram. If one accepts the Kushan royal board theory and the 3rd century AD date for the abandonment or destruction of the site, the historical data on the expansion of the Sasanian Empire may be one explanation for the defeat of the Kushan Empire and thus the city's demise. Osman Boperachi has argued, however, that on the basis of numismatic analysis, the demise of the Kushan period should be placed at the end of the 3rd century AD rather than the mid-3rd century AD. If, however, one gravitates towards contemporaneity of the Begram objects and their place as part of a merchant stock or trade stock, then it seems reasonable to assume that the rooms were abandoned with no more than one generation of the fabrication of the pieces. This suggests that the objects were left behind at some time in the late 1st or early 2nd century AD. To support this, it may be useful to examine the larger economic context of ancient Begram. The global reach of Begram-type ivory carvings is provided by the ivory statuette discovered at Pompeii, very similar to the large Begram ivory figurines discovered in room 10. Note the similar rosette hair ornament worn on the forehead and the bracelets worn on the Begram example. The Pompeii figurine carries a terminus antiquem date of 79 CE, when the Vesuvius erupted and buried Pompeii in a layer of ash. Judging from the Kharoshti inscription on the base of the Pompeii ivory, and significantly for the argument here regarding local workshops in the region of Gandhara, it may have come from somewhere in the northwestern regions of India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Although stylistically, it is closer to the art of central and western India. Recently, Dan Potts analyzed a number of ivory combs discovered in the 1st century CE tomb in the United Arab Emirate of Sharjah, site of Dibba al-Hizn. Then the combs are very similar to the 1st century CE Taxila combs in content and execution. Most importantly, the graves contained a number of other foreign goods, including Roman glassware, such as pillar-molded bowls and carnelian beads. The combination of glassware and ivory suggests that Dibba al-Hizn was connected to a similar network of trade as Begram. It is highly likely that the Roman glassware and other products made their way via sea to the ports of Babaricum and Barigaza, from where they traveled north to modern Afghanistan, in all likelihood to connect to the Chinese overland trade route. It is Begram's link in this economic chain that is important in understanding why the site could have been in decline in the 2nd century CE and why the hoard was sealed up. It is not to dismiss the total abandonment of the site in the 3rd century CE, but to suggest that other events impact urban centers may have led to an earlier decline of Begram. To suggest tectonic and climatological factors would be facile here and hard to prove. Nevertheless, both Dalvesin Tepe and Kampir Tepe of the Kushan site seem to have suffered floods in the 2nd century CE due to the shift in the course of the Amudarya, which destroyed part of the city. Marshall believed that Taxila suffered an earthquake in the 1st. Pompeii was buried under lava in the 1st. Afghanistan falls victim to an average of 100 measurable earthquakes a year. The study of earthquakes in archaeological context is complex, and although scientific community has made advances, there's no evidence as yet from Begram itself to suggest where plate tectonics had a role in the demise of the city. I have one page, that's it. If it can be successfully argued that Begram was not merely a royal city but a center of trade, it is the possibility of an economic decline that might be a fruitful area of focus for future research. For decades, scholars have described a somewhat homogeneous Kushan empire and an era of Silk Road expansion born in the 1st century CE. Born in the 1st century CE, reaching a crescendo during Vishnishka's time in the 2nd, and coming to an end with the Sasanian expansion in the 3rd. Yet the chronology of Dalvesin, Taxila, and even Begram suggests that there were gaps. Dalvesin sees both an expansion and decline in the 2nd century AD or CE. Sirkap declines in population and is abandoned in the late 1st century CE. And even with all the confusion regarding the chronology of Begram, there's a gap between the 1st and 2nd century rulers and later kings of the Kushan period. Were there underlying economic factors for the decline as well? Begram becomes important in part due to overland trade with China in the 1st century CE. Very interestingly, the routes through the so-called Western regions, modern Xinjiang, China, according to the Han Chronicles, were closed off or at the very least significantly impacted by the withdrawal of China between 107 and 123 CE. First at the hands of the Xiongnu and second at the Qian. In effect, cutting off overland route until the emergence of Kanishka. The 2nd century too saw the first documented official maritime visit of a Roman envoy to China in 166. The shift to maritime commerce to China in the 2nd century CE could have had a result, or could have been a result of the interruption of land-based commerce, which would have severely impacted the northern region in general and Begram in particular. I can't get to that, that's very... Just let me finish by very briefly addressing the modern journey. And many people are going to talk about the tragedy and the destruction of Afghan cultural heritage. I just wanted to contextualize what happened to the Begram Ivories. The story, of course, begins, the destabilization begins with the Soviet invasion of 79, which lasted for 10 years until 89. In 89, Mohammad Najibullah, then president, who presided over the withdrawal of Soviet troops in Afghanistan, ordered, in collaboration with the curators, the permanent collection sealed into crates and put into the vaults of the presidential palace. That is where they remained, and that is where they were forgotten until the post-Taliban period In the meantime, of course, we all know what happened subsequently in the 1990s, the destruction of the Kabul Museum through bombing campaigns as well as through looting. And over the course of that time, most people had thought that the permanent collection had disappeared, was taken away, was sold. And sporadically, ivories did come up on the international market, so it wasn't that far-fetched. But ultimately, under the auspices of National Geographic, collaboration with the Ministry of Culture and the Kabul Museum, they went into the presidential vaults, opened up the safes, as you can see here, and then discovered that much of what had been on display in Kabul Museum had remained intact. Almost all the Bactrian gold, not all the ivories. Some of that has indeed disappeared, but most of the gold and a lot of other sculpture, Buddhist sculpture, remained. And that is ultimately what went on an international tour, Europe, the US, and also Australia. I have lost track where it is, to be quite honest. It was a year, it's in Japan. Yeah. Last year it was in Australia, and then I lost track. It's good to know it's still on tour, so now it's in Japan. Thank you so much, and I hope that I didn't go over time.
Density of research and attention, and I'm also very impressed by the breadth, because the number of references you bring in of material finds, cognate phenomena from around the world actually deeply enriches the interpretation of the Begram finds, for which we can only thank you for sharing this with us. I have to also say that those of you who don't already know Sanjyot's work, she's done fantastic website where all of the ivories are very beautifully catalogued by her, and I recommend browsing that for pleasure and edification.
Yeah, that was my life as a doctoral student.
Really?
Stuck in the archives.
It's remarkable. It's very fascinating to say, but you can't help also being impressed by the global nature of this whole phenomenon. And when you suggest at the end that coastal rooms are sealed up because the trade with China is interrupted, it really makes you stop in your tracks, right, and think about our understanding of globalization as we have been challenged to think about several times in this last day and a half.
Well, globalization is an interesting one. You know, the glassware, I don't work on the glass, I'm not a glass specialist, but they have been analyzed. And one thing you do with glass is you try to source it, right? You try to find the sand, which lies at the heart of the making of a finished glass product. And most of the Begram glassware sources to Roman Egypt, primarily. However, our own excavations in Sri Lanka, underwater excavations, show us the trade in raw glass, right?
Right.
Raw glass ingots. Now, if you were to, right, make
So
that...
would you like to tell everyone about this?
It's not, it was just the reference to globalization. It's a headache, right? It's a headache because everything that we thought was clear is not clear. Because one could argue, if you have very distinct pieces of glassware that are not analogous to anything that you can find, right? You analyze them, it goes back to Roman Egypt, but we can imagine that there are glass industries at Bamiyan. What if glass ingots were imported into this region and were fabricated into finished product? Is it a Roman object? I wouldn't think so. It's a local object. So that I think is, you know, an itinerancy. Somebody once, you know, yelled out from the audience, itinerancy is a headache for archaeologists. Stop talking about that. Stop talking about itinerancy, because then all these classifications that we have become somewhat problematic. So.
Are there questions?
Yes, yes.
Thank you, Sanjyot. That was marvelous. I've had lots of parallels that I've been trying to draw over the years with all the Eastern Indian finds of ivory or the Chandraketu ones that have been coming up. And I wondered if you had any opportunity to examine the Eastern Indian finds.
No, I haven't really been working that much on sort of the larger context of the ivories recently, so I haven't kept up, but I'd be happy to have any reference.
I wanted to say that, well, apart from the fact that there are very strong parallels, this has forced one to rewind to a lot of the questions that you raised about whether the objects have when attributing them to Indian provenance, does one attribute it to Sanchi, Mathura, Amravati, or somewhere else in the Deccan? And one of the reasons is that we've had such poor documentation of the ornamental detail at Amravati and at Mathura that even these major sites have not been adequately photographed. And as a result, our corpus is incomplete. So when we're trying to make these parallels, and it's hard. And over the past few years, in revisiting these sites and noticing the decorative bands and design motifs, it's now becoming even more difficult in the sense that what you said is absolutely true, that it's so widespread as a northern South Asian decorative vocabulary that it's very, very hard to stick to the old books that attributed certain things only to one part of South Asia. It's not easy to do
And
that.
interestingly enough, there is a certain linear progression in that. We always think that things come from the south and go north, right? What if itinerant artisans were located in the north and were bringing things south, right? The Kharoshti, the Pompeii one with the Kharoshti inscription, an identical one was found in Bokardon. Now most scholars then say, oh, it's made in Bokardon, goes up north, or it goes, why not the other way around, right? There's
exactly,
there's no
material is
yeah, so I think kind of this more complex understanding which you also brought up yesterday, I think is very
about the plaques, I think that the drilling of these uncomfortable holes is a very common phenomenon when one thinks of carpenters who have to be faithful to the structure of what they are soldering or applying these plaques to. And since they were all polychromed in any case, all the nail marks and things would have all been covered up. But by adhering it at the most strategic point in the piece of furniture, it would have ensured that the plaque stay on the furniture for as long as possible.
Sure. But you would think that if I were also a furniture maker, that you would have some sense in kind of the organization of the plaque. And the holes can be I mean, I'm not disputing that the holes can be everywhere, but they're not linear, and it seems like these are very special pieces, you would think, right? I mean, very beautifully carved. And even though...
but also mass-produced, because there is so many hundreds and hundreds of them. So I think a lot of the specialness that we accord ivory in antiquity is, if the volume of ivory trade and the number of pieces is so huge that we're really looking at something that is also being mass-produced almost.
Right. Yeah. Well, that was my argument anyway. Yeah. In my dissertation, I was trying to accommodate sort of this idea of heterogeneity and to figure out, is this special to particular plaques, right? Because you don't see it in other plaques, right? So there are a certain number of plaques in the Begram corpus that have this random, I describe as random drillings, but not on others. The others are very meticulously laid out, so that's all. They stand out in that way, and that's all I was arguing.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Did you have a question, Reenu? Because then we should actually break for
Yeah, I can ask.
No, let yours be the last, and then we take it.
I just want to make a quick comment on this thing of holes. It couldn't just be a recycling, right? That something, because ivory is a delicate thing, and maybe bits have fallen off, and some artisan who didn't produce it has come and just plonked it on somewhere else. That's just a comment. I wanted to ask, you were saying that many things from the museum were stolen, including a lot of the ivories, or stolen or went missing. How do you know, we can't go back in history and say why and what, but today, how do you feel there is a circle of responsibility between dealers and auction houses and academics where, you know, the auction house or dealer recognizes something as being very rare and important, and they will at least inform academics so these things can be recorded before they get sold off into private collections? Or is that happening? Is
Oh,
there
that's
such-
happening. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, recently, when the exhibit was in the BM, a corpus was returned to Afghanistan and was part of the exhibit. Was an added, was an addition. So lost pieces that had been bought up on the international market were recognized as part of the Begram, and then there was pressure, right, by academics, by others, right, to return these to Afghanistan. And I think yes, we do bear that responsibility.
This is something that Fahim Rahimi mentions in his presentation, which we'll have after tea. So.
And I want to say not just return, but even if it is legitimately stolen and it isn't a stolen object directly, or including things that are in collections from, say, 30, 20, 30, 40 years ago. I mean, is there a way that collectors could then sort of say to you that we have this and we want it recorded? Because after all, I think the recording of a lot of these is very important to scholars to have access to them, actually. So
yeah, I think you have to create the environment where you can have that dialogue, because I think for many collectors, they don't want the finger pointed, right? I mean, it's a very difficult position to be in. You may have the best of intentions, and but then it becomes, you have an international outcry. Why do you have these objects? So you have to create a kind of dialogue, I think, that allows you to present pieces, away from a private collection to, for use by a larger audience. I do think, as an archaeologist and an academic, for me, when I work with my students, I do try to stress knowledge over the object, right? In my own work, these are exquisite pieces, I know, but I like to sort of suggest the ways in which they are important for our understanding of the past, and therefore they should be, brought into the light and looked at by scholars and by members of the general public. But you can have that dialogue, and it's ongoing, and pieces have returned, right? The original catalog that I worked on, there were 600 finished pieces, and altogether there were broken off pieces. I cataloged about 1,100. But you look at what was in the exhibit, that's a fraction. You look at what is in Gimei, ultimately. So that chairback 161 that I showed, that's disappeared. That's in Pakistan. So there are, of the crates that Najibullah had sealed up, one or two of those crates did go missing, and the objects ended up on the international market, on the bazaars. But the Bactrian gold is complete. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.